Hey, my relatives, it's Mark Charles. This is Monday, June 28th, and I'm sitting down to drink my second cup of coffee. And I wanted to do something a bit unique because this coming Sunday, July 4th, obviously is Independence Day, the 4th of July, and our nation will be celebrating its independence, the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on that day. And I want to kind of be addressing this holiday and our declaration throughout the week. So I'm going to begin today by actually doing a reading of the Declaration of Independence, because if I know most Americans, while they know the quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," they don't know what the entire Declaration actually says. And so I thought it would be good, if we're going to have a discussion about it throughout the week, to begin by reading it today. So that's my agenda. But before I get going, let me do as I always do, which is acknowledge I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Piscataway. This is now known as Washington, D.C., and I am very humbled to be living here. I want to thank the Piscataway, as they are the host peoples of these lands. I want to publicly acknowledge that they are still here and present on these lands, and I just want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. There is a lot going on in the country right now. If you have been watching, Vice President Harris was down at the southern border last week. Obviously, President Biden just returned from one of his first international trips. There's a crisis going on in Florida with the collapse of a condominium there. And there is a scorching heat wave that first was in the Southwest, and now it is in the Pacific Northwest. And there's also an incredible drought going on in the Southwest right now too. And so we are in the midst of evidence of climate change, evidence of international crisis. There's a lot of things going on. Obviously, our country still can't handle discussion on immigration. Shootings are happening almost daily, right? Things are just there's a lot going on. And so, but on Sunday, in a week from yesterday, our country will celebrate the 4th of July, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And if you've been following me and you have been following my social media, even my blog posts over the past 5, 10, even 15 years, almost 20 years, you know that for a long time I have been critiquing the Declaration of Independence as well as our nation's celebration of the 4th of July. In my lectures I give on the Doctrine of Discovery, as well as in the chapters we'll be discussing this week in my book study, Chapter 6, we're looking at the foundations of our country. And while we have a Declaration of Independence that states we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, A, it never mentions women, and B, 30 lines later, it refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. So our Declaration of Independence is a very, not only sexist, but white supremacist document that has been deeply influenced by the Doctrine of Discovery. And I've been critiquing this for a number of years. If you just Google my name and Declaration of Independence, you will see that there's a lot of articles I've written, op-eds I've published out there. And you might even see this graphic, which I created 5 or 6 years ago, that now gets fairly widely distributed, where I just highlight the word merciless Indian savages in the midst of the Declaration of Independence, just to show people that it really is there. I'm not making this up. I remember the first time I saw it, it was there. It kind of shocked me. And so today, what I wanted to do, because again, most Americans, while we treat our founding documents like there's some kind of sacred text, most of us don't read them and don't even know what they say. And what that does is it allows our politicians to lie to us. Joe Biden loves to lie by misquoting the Declaration of Independence. He says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. That sounds great, Joe. It doesn't say that. And if we can't acknowledge it doesn't say that, we're never going to fix the problem caused by the fact that it does say that. And the same thing with President Obama, right? He misquoted the Constitution. He said, "We the people." The Constitution begins with these 3 simple words we now recognize mean all the people. Sounds beautiful, Mr. President, former President Obama. It's not true. We've never concluded as a nation that we the people actually means all the people. And to prove it, I ran a campaign in 2020 where the nation very clearly stated it did not want to have that discussion. And the media did not want to address those issues that were coming up. And so we have a problem where we have these foundations that most people believe advocate for freedom and equality and the humanity of everybody. But if you actually read them, it's quite the contrary. And so today, what I would like to do is I would like to read the Declaration of Independence. It's going to be a bit of a choppy read. I haven't read this publicly before yet, but I want to read it just so that we can have it in front of us, and I'm going to share it. I got it from the most official place I could find, which is the U.S. Archives, archives.gov, and there is a text version of the Declaration of Independence. So the text I'll be reading comes directly from there. As they said, the misspellings, and unfortunately not the mispronunciations, but the misspellings are from the original document. So if you'll just join me, this won't take incredibly long. The declaration, it's a single page, but it's important that we read it. And I'm not going to be discussing it today. I will be discussing it later this week and throughout the week. I'll be sharing op-eds that I've written. I'll be hopefully having some guests on to talk about different aspects of the Declaration. And as I read it today, I want to encourage you to do one thing, which is I want you to not just listen to the words, but listen to the words in light of and in context of the racial and sexist injustices and oppressions and systemic challenges that our nation has been facing, even within the past 20 to 30 years. Think about our history of slavery. Think about our history of boarding schools. Think about what we've done to Black and brown people. Think about the way that we have treated these marginalized communities. Think about these things as I'm reading the text of our Declaration of Independence, because if our Constitution is the basis for our laws, our Declaration begins to set up the values for our laws. It's kind of our value statement as a nation. This is what we believe. This is what we hold firm. So I invite you to think about our nation and the racial and context of our country as I read through this declaration, and even think about how our nation currently deals with protesters. I'm not talking white terrorists who go to commandeer the White House, right? They get let in and they get let out and they get put on parole. I'm talking about when Black and Native and other people of color protest. And when we call out the injustices of our nation, what happens then? And I want you to think about that juxtaposition as I'm reading through our very own Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, I know I pronounced that wrong, pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. 1. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. 2. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. 3. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation to the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measure. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the right of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be neglected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of evasion and without convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing to assent to laws for establishing judicial powers. He has made judges dependent upon his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit for the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unwarranted the head of a civilized nation. Unworthy, the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captives on the high seas to bear arms against our country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, and to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislator to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these observations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. I don't know that word. We must therefore acquiesce to the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of these United States of America in General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. We have a lot to discuss this week. The complaints that the white landowning men of the 13 colonies had against the King of Britain are actually not that dissimilar. That Native men and women, African Americans, and other marginalized communities have against our own government. And we need to remember that when these founding fathers wrote and signed this declaration, many of them were slave owners. All of them were living on land without treaty. They were in the act of committing genocide against Native peoples. They were literally stealing lands based on a doctrine of discovery and an assumption of promised lands. So we have a lot to discuss this week. Our nation continues in incredible arrogance to celebrate a very narrow definition of freedom and a very exclusive understanding of equality. And if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't wrestle with it, we're never going to change it. And that's the work we have to do as a nation. I think we need to read this Declaration of Independence on a regular basis, at least annually, if not more, to remind ourselves not how far we've come, but how little progress we've actually made. I hope this has been helpful, my relatives. I hope that you will join me throughout the rest of this week. I'm not positive I'm going to be on every day discussing this, but I will at least be on 2 or 3 more times this week. And then on Friday, we'll be discussing chapter 6 of my book, which will look at the founding documents of this nation and how they've been impacted by the doctrine of discovery, including the Declaration of Independence. So I want to take this whole week to really help our nation wrestle with the lack of integrity that our founding documents have. And I want to quit talking about how much progress we've made and talk about how these documents were written in absolute hypocrisy and how little progress we've actually made since they were first penned. This is the conversation we have to have. This is the common memory we have to create. This is the history we need to learn how to wrestle with. Thanks for joining me, my relatives. I hope you have a very good day. I hope you have a good week. I look forward to the conversations we're going to have. And may we walk in beauty. And may we learn and even use these types of discussions to learn how to walk in beauty together. Ahiahat and hakonet.